Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we are stepping away from Arnhem and the operations in Brittany and the south of France today to look at a Scottish diplomat, agent, uh, all sorts of things he's involved in, whose exploits saw him connect with people like Trotsky, Oswald Mosley, Anthony Eden, Eisenhower. And of course, for special interest to this channel in with regards World War II, he was part of the development of what we would call today psychological warfare. My guest is James Crossland, a historian and author of this book, which is the subject we're talking about today, Rogue Agent. I'll bring James in now. Good evening, James. How are you today?
Good evening, Paul. I'm fine. Thank you for having me on the show.
Good. So, as you know, writing that introduction, which my introductions have to fit on a post-it note, otherwise they're too long. Extraordinary a career, which we'll get into later on, of how many people he brushed shoulders with over decades of work for the British in various aspects. But how did you discover the story, and what brought you to it? Because you've written about intelligence in other eras of history, but what brought you to this subject?
So this project I've been sitting on for the better part of a decade is when I started writing the book. To be honest, I think I first became familiar with Robert Bruce Lockhart, I'd say about 20 years ago, when I was starting at university. And the man who became my PhD supervisor had an interest in him and taught a course on intelligence history, where he talked about Lockhart's exploits in Russia in 1918 at the end of the First World War. And I remember when I became his PhD student, this guy said, "Oh, I've always wanted to write a book about this guy, but I'm too old and fed up to bother anymore. So why don't you do it?" And I started reading up on him, and I realized that there's a lot more to this man than the main thing for which he was known, which was the Lockhart plot of 1918, this British intelligence failure in Russia, and realized that he did have this very full, as you alluded to, very full life in which he rubbed shoulders with everyone and everything and got involved in all kinds of things during a period when, going from the First World War through the interwar period, the Second World War, and into the early Cold War. So he's right in the midst of some world-shaping events, and he is getting involved in all kinds of adventures and misadventures. So it's somewhat of a passion project.
And as we'll find out, you don't survive that long if you can't get on with lots of people, because he would have seen governments that are left-leaning, right-leaning, big personalities, different personalities, and if you've been on the fringes of all those aspects for a long time, you've got to be able to play the game, because so many people from the interwar period, they're liked by one group of people, then they just disappear completely because a new lot come in and they're brushed aside, and the views of the British public and the British government are changing all the time about Russia and about Germany, and so you've got to be a survivor to kind of keep that whole thing going. So I'm guessing that's what he was, to be around for so long. He knew how to play the game and survive.
Yeah, the thing about Lockhart that was really unique for his time was that in an era where everyone's either swinging to the left or swinging to the right, he actually isn't that big. He enjoys politics. He writes about politics. He thinks about politics, but he is not an ideological person. He will go with the flow of things. He will see the good in Leon Trotsky, and then he will hang out with Oswald Mosley for a bit. And both of them, he's examining them. He's curious about them. He wants to know why they think the way they do, and this is what makes him very good at intelligence gathering. He is willing to talk to anyone about a thing, and he's such a charming guy that people will always open up to him. So it's a unique quality, and this is part of the reason why he's able to move through so many different circles, make so many friends, and get so many chances as well, and opportunities given to him by some of the most powerful people of this era.
Brilliant stuff. Well, we'll bring up your PowerPoint, and folks, Feel free to jump in with the questions. People are already mentioning, does Arthur Ransom come up in this? Is this connected with Riley, Ace of Spies? And I think we'll find the answers to some of those questions as we go along. But basically, I'm going to hand over to you, to James, to kind of take us through. We can't do his entire career, otherwise we'd be here for 7 or 8 hours. But kind of a thumbnail sketch of his early life, and then kind of moving to the meat of today's show, which is the World War II aspect. So over to you, James.
Thank you. So just to outline the man, as I say, this is a very brief synopsis of some of the main eras of his life and things he gets involved in. What's unique about him is that he is Scottish through and through. He's very proud of the fact that he doesn't set foot on English soil until he's been to Germany and France. Picks up French and German very quickly. He has a head for languages. Goes to Malaysia, tries to be a rubber plantation owner. That does not go well. It's beyond his capabilities. But he picks up Malay very, very quickly there, and has that in his locker for the rest of his life. Joins the Foreign Office, is a kind of bright young thing sent to Moscow, is there as a consul, and it's during the First World War that he gets a reputation in Whitehall for being a guy who can do intelligence, because he produces intelligence reports, which I read through these. I've read through a lot of intelligence reports in my time, and most of them are very dry. His are a pleasure to read. He's a very gifted writer, and that gets attention as well as his keen eye for observation. And it's that reputation, plus the fact that he picks up Russian in about 6 months.
Wow.
Pretty incredible. It's that reputation, his gift of language, his knowledge of Russian culture, and his willingness to immerse himself in it, that leads to him being deployed back to Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. He's sent there as the British agent by Prime Minister Lloyd George. The British agent basically means he's a quasi-diplomat. He's there to establish relations with the Bolshevik regime on behalf of His Majesty's government. But he's also doing some intelligence work, and he's given a very loose brief, which is to keep the Russians in the war. And I say the word Russians there because that's the important point.
Yep.
It becomes clear that the Bolsheviks are not going to re-enter the war after they extract themselves from it in March of 1918. That's when Lockhart, with, as someone's already asked, the so-called Ace of Spies, Sidney Riley, and a coterie of other assorted ne'er-do-wells from the British, French, and American missions in Russia, spies and diplomats, they get together and come up with this plan to try and subvert a battalion of the Red Army, get it to turn on Lenin and Trotsky and launch a coup d'etat. This plan fails because the Russian secret police are very good and they are on top of it, the Cheka. They are able to penetrate this plot from the beginning, basically, and the conspirators most of them end up in jail. Lockhart included, is kept in the Kremlin for some time until he's released on a prisoner exchange. And this is where, in the historical record, he vanishes. Historians don't seem to care much about him after this point because he's kind of written off. He's seen as this failure. But then when you look at what happens after, you realize, to your point about the people he knows and the influence he can wield over people, he's given all kinds of chances. He works for the Foreign Office. He's still kind of working for British intelligence in a very nebulous way in the 1920s as well, in Central Europe, monitoring the onward march of communism. He also gathers economic intelligence for the Bank of England, which was a unique role at the time, but very important given the reconstruction of Europe that's happening at the time, the amount of money the British government's pumping into that. His gift of prose and his ability to write and to extract information from people grabs the attention of Lord Beaverbook, who is the Rupert Murdoch of this era, extraordinarily powerful media magnate, who thinks a lot of Lockhart and basically makes him his right-hand man on Fleet Street. And in that capacity, Lockhart becomes, amongst other things, a pretty well-known journalist, an interviewer of the famous and glamorous. He's a best-selling author. I've got the cover there of his Memoirs of a British Agent, a heavily falsified account of his activities in Russia, covering up the full extent of the plot, but a cracking read all the same. And by the time we get to the 1930s, he is still so much in the game with intelligence figures and key political figures in Whitehall that he joins what are essentially these nascent anti-fascist intelligence gathering networks who are running around Europe, the United States, gathering information on support for Hitler on both sides of the pond. He's also disseminating propaganda for the British Council, pro-democracy, anti-fascist propaganda. And throughout all of this, as I say at the end there, he is always drinking. It was said, Lord Beaverbook said that if not for women, Lockhart would be prime minister by now. This was in the mid 1930s.
Wow.
He has an addiction to drink, to nightlife, to women, and these vices haunt him through all of his ups and downs, peaks and troughs of his multifaceted career.
But he must have been able to. He had to be very astute to be able to do it. To move in the circles he was doing, and survive. Yeah, sure, he's good. With gift of the gab, he's able to blend in and out with his use of languages. But he must be providing solid, decent intel and information. I mean, the Bank of England, when it's money involved, if he's coming through with duff information, they're going to drop him like a stone, aren't they? So he must have really quickly learned how to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, and provide really good, solid interpretation of what's going on around him. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, he's a one-man intelligence cycle. He was capable of directing where he wanted to go, gathering the information, analyzing it, compiling it, and even and oftentimes overstepping the mark a bit by advising action on intelligence.
Wow.
He's very comprehensive. He's very perceptive, and he's highly intelligent as well. These are almost like God-given gifts that he has to be able to read people, to understand situations, and to not be afraid of throwing himself into dangerous situations, which is something that there's a lot of British diplomats at this time who are, compared to Lockhart, quite timid and quite judgmental about the world that is changing very rapidly around them, be it Bolshevism, fascism, whatever it is. Lockhart is more of an open book. He is genuinely curious about this world around him and the good and the bad, and he's not afraid of either. So he's willing to get in there and to gather information, whether it's upsetting, whether it's somehow against British policy or it upsets British policy. He doesn't care. He doesn't mind offending people if he's coming up with something that's gold, and oftentimes he does.
I mean, this is in an era when people want you to declare your ideology. They these movements and organizations and parties and that are forming in that interwar period, they all want to know that the people they're recruiting are of a similar mind to them. So he must have been kind of playing the game again, like I said earlier, to keep people on his side without overly committing to what their causes are, just kind of bending with the breeze and being kind of vague about things, which is extraordinary skill to be able to do that, to be able to move from the circles. We're already dealing with someone who's dealing with communists, the pre-communist era, and now the rise of fascists, and you've got to move and deal with all those people. Incredible people skills, incredible ability to kind of give an openness that people like, but at the same time not give too much information about what you agree. Just nod a lot and say yes and no. And I guess it's extraordinary.
He does actually get criticized by he has plenty of detractors, and
right.
One criticism of him is that he is too servile at times to people,
right,
and does say what they want to hear. But it is, as you say, it's part of the game with him. He's smart enough to know that there are certain things you should say in certain situations, certain things you shouldn't, and he's cautious with his words. But for the most part, I mean, he does have lapses, and a lot of these I chronicle in Rogue Agent, where he really puts his foot in it with regards to some things he says to certain people. But as regards to his political leanings and how you gauge his allegiances, perhaps the most illustrative thing I can say is that I think it's towards the end of the 1930s, there's an MI5 report on him when they're figuring out who's going to do what in the war to come. MI5 do a background check on him, and there's a wonderful passage of the report where the guy says, well, he was very close to the Bolsheviks back in the day, but we suspect that he's now hanging around with Mosley and the fascists. And it's like, that just says it all. You know, he's suspected of on being both from the far right and the far left, and he's neither. He's just a guy who gets places and talks to people.
Brilliant stuff. Well, back to you.
So that's basically where he gets up to by the time we are entering the period we want to look at this evening, which is principally his work in the Second World War. Someone mentioned before about Arthur Ransom. I'll address that now. Yes, he is a lifelong friend of Arthur Ransom's. They form a bond in Russia together just before Ransom is recruited into MI6. And they are both writers, so they have Lockhart maintains a correspondence with Arthur Ransom into the 50s, 60s, I think. And Sidney Riley, he stays in contact with until Riley is eventually executed by the Cheka in 1925. So he doesn't lose many friends. He does keep them around until circumstances take them from him. And it's these friends that stand him in good stead for what's going to happen as the Second World War looms, where he is tapped on the shoulder, basically as part of these informal networks of recruitment for a job in propaganda. And the man who taps him on the shoulder is this fella here, Rex Leeper, who is a really influential figure in his life. Rex Leeper was helping him out during his time in Moscow. He was working in Britain to provide a kind of political support for his mission. And he remembers Lockhart. They stay in touch, and he remembers Lockhart's intelligence and his perceptiveness. And in the 1930s, what Leeper is trying to do from his position in the Foreign Office, he's a pretty low-ranked Foreign Office official, but he is in the intelligence game, and he wants to set up a propaganda organization to take on the Nazis when the war starts. And he's using the World War I propaganda organization that was called Crew House as a template. Now, Crew House is interesting in that it is this heavily mythologized organization, mainly mythologized by the man who was in charge of it, Sir Campbell Stewart. For some reason, his name is inverted on that advert there. But he wrote a very glorified book called The Secrets of Crew House, in which he basically argued that propaganda had won Britain the First World War, which it hadn't. But he bigged up the value of propaganda so much that on the road to the Second World War, there were a number of officials in Whitehall who thought that, well, we really need to concentrate on this and get it together and make sure that we have a well-financed, well-organized, well-staffed department that is dedicated to propaganda that can undermine German morale and run deception operations to an extent. And that department ends up being something called Department EH, or Electra House, named after where it was originally based in London. And Leeper asks Lockhart, do you want to join this? Lockhart is reluctant throughout his life, and this is why I call my book Rogue Agent, because he is both an asset of Britain in various guises, but he is also an inherently individualistic rogue of a character who does not like being fettered. And by this stage, by the late 1930s, he has quit the Foreign Office. He is trying to be an author. He's trying to live by his pen. He has a romantic side to him that he wants to indulge. But duty calls when the war breaks out, and he says to Leeper, yes, fine, I can lend what talents I have to this. But he's very specific, Lockhart is, about saying, I know a lot about Central Europe and Russia. He was based in Prague after the war at the consulate there for several years after Russia. He's like, use my knowledge of these areas for intelligence. And instead, he gets lumped into the intelligence wing of this new propaganda organization. And he gets sent out to a place in the Bedfordshire countryside called Woburn Abbey, pictured here. And his assessment of the people he is working with, I have captioned down at the bottom there. Freaks, some genuine antiques, several fakes, and a few geniuses. And this is, and what's ironic about this statement is that Lockhart does fit in with this motley crew, because by this stage, as I say, he's a guy who has lived a plethora of lives, had multiple careers. He's still remembered for the failure of the Lockhart plot in 1918. He still has that shadow hanging over him. He has a reputation, a well-earned reputation, for being a guy who drinks too much, who can be a little bit unreliable, can be a bit headstrong, arrogant even. And he does fit in with the group of people Lipa assembles at Woburn Abbey to run propaganda, but he's also somewhat dismissive of them. And just to give you a snapshot of the kind of people we're talking, not just these kind of Whitehall hangers-on like Lockhart, but there are professional writers, there are journalists, there are poets, there are artists, there are linguists, there are university lecturers, there are public school headmasters. It's a odd mix of folks, and their task is to develop fake news, misinformation, and disinformation that can be used to undermine morale in the Reich.
And how is he keeping relevant, so to speak? Because we talk a lot on this channel about, with World War II, there's so many new types of warfare. There's commandos and parachute forces and electronic jamming warfare in Bomber Command and all this, that, and the other. And there are these progressive, mostly younger people who are championing these new ideas. And Churchill, who isn't a younger person, is championing these ideas. But it's notoriously an era of the stuffy old War Office people just not seeing the future. They're still essentially trying to fight First World War or previous wars. How is Lockhart keeping his hand in the game? Is he reading extensively? Is he just able to keep on? Does he hang around with young people? How is, I mean, I'm in my mid-50s. He's in his mid-50s. How is he keeping with it in this ever-changing environment?
Well, he's always reading. He's always talking to people. He's always getting external stimuli. He's always taking in information. But at the same hand, he is old, and he is a bit set in his ways, as we all get at a certain point. And so by the time the Second World War rolls around, he's a man of two parts. He is both this inherent, very individualistic, brazen cavalier, the Lockhart of his youth, but he's also an old Whitehall hand, and he understands how that works. The stuffiness you mentioned, he understands that, and he understands that's not going anywhere. So on the one hand, the romantic side of Lockhart says to himself, this propaganda stuff is really interesting. It's very cutting edge. In the 1930s, when he's doing these intelligence gathering on fascism, he's in Berlin watching Goebbels do his thing. He's seen this, and he's terrified and impressed by it in equal measure. He understands, from the time he spends in Germany before the war, he understands that Nazi Germany has been built off the back of propaganda. He understands how powerful it can be when it's done incredibly well. And what he's despairing of when he gets to Woburn is that Britain is just kind of half-assing it, that they are not going to do it well. This is not that they've given Lipa and Campbell Stewart, who is recalled from his duties of crew house from the First World War, based on his legend, he's brought back in to run a lecture house, and they are not given a big budget. They are not given a lot of support, and the stuffy old types who you mentioned before at the War Office, they're looking at this lot and going, well, they're just a joke, aren't they? And to be fair, the propagandists don't do themselves any favors in trying to correct that image. Because from the moment you get to Woburn Abbey, there are memoirs left behind by the inmates of that particular asylum, talking about how they get there and the place is half finished. There are arguments instantly between the left-wing writers and the ones who are more monarchist and want to appeal to conservative groups in Germany and try to get resistance going. So you have an ideological conflict between them. There's a very kind of prima donna-y work ethic. There are stories about people going out for lunch at 1 p.m., coming back at 9 a.m. the next morning with a hangover. And there are rumors in Whitehall that there are limousines full of prostitutes and champagne being shepherded out to the Bedfordshire countryside in the dead of night to keep these guys going. So there's this sort of bohemian indulgent vibe at Woburn that, again, there's a part of Lockhart that that suits him to a T. But there's another part of him, more practical, more seasoned part, that's looking at this and going, well, actually, this isn't going to get us anywhere.
Brilliant stuff. I mean, it reminds me of all those early war. SOE was, the similar thing at the beginning. Everybody was a friend of a friend, and it starts off getting very unwieldy. Then later on, in the war, these organizations become more streamlined, more disciplined. They become more like, official government departments or official British regiments. But there's that sort of 41 period where it's almost of anything goes. And, I'll bring in my friend, he's good at this or she's good at that. And but you could, that pool of talents that was being brought in is one of the genius moves that Churchill did, bringing, allowing people from outside of the establishment to look at how to win the war. But it does get a bit crazy for a while before until it gets reined in a bit. But fascinating stuff.
That's precisely it. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned SOE. These people are all in the same boat. Lockhart joins SOE when it's first conceived of, and there is a lot of overlap between these various departments, which is finally consolidated with the creation of the Political Warfare Executive, which actually grows out of the propaganda wing of SOE, the detritus from Woburn, and a few other bits and bobs from other areas, the more informal propaganda departments in the Foreign Office, etc. So the Political Warfare Executive is conceived of as the solution to the propaganda problems, and the problems are extensive. So the people at Woburn, they are developing propaganda that is at best ineffective, at worst sad and laughable. One of the first air raids the RAF conducts in the Second World War, with hours after Chamberlain's speech, is dropping pamphlets over Germany, propaganda pamphlets, and these pamphlets say basically, "Hey, German person reading this, Hitler's a loony, don't follow him." And then on the back, you've got this very dry Neville Chamberlain speech. And that's the propaganda. And this is part of what Lockhart's got a problem with. He's looking at this and going, well, this isn't going to do anything. This is laughably bad. And by the time we get to 1941, the situation, not just the quality of the propaganda, but the strife between those tasks with putting together this propaganda campaign has gotten so intense that it's decided that they're going to consolidate all this, start a new body that is going to be, to your point, a little bit like SOE, but more about words and ideas and psychological warfare than blowing things up and shooting people with Sten guns. So Lockhart is made Director General in 1942. He's put in charge of this, and that's Churchill approves this. Lockhart is a very good friend of Anthony Eden's. Eden, of course, backs this play. So he is trading on those contacts for this. But then if you look at his career, you look at everything he's done, his background in intelligence, his gift for writing, his understanding of propaganda, his travels in Europe, which a lot of these people had not done. He has firsthand experience of what the Reich looks like and how it operates. He's actually quite well qualified for this job. And once he's put in charge, he immediately starts reviewing everything that's happened. And just for those who aren't aware, just to talk a little bit about this kind of propaganda and to establish how it's different to some of the propaganda you might think of when we think about home front propaganda, Ministry of Information, that sort of stuff to raise British morale. The kind of propaganda PWE is dealing with falls broadly into three categories. There's white propaganda, which are the truths that assist a particular narrative, selective truths of a situation. There's black propaganda, which is flat out lies, what today we would probably call fake news, designed to distort a narrative. And then there's the most sophisticated of the two, which is grey propaganda, which obviously is a combination of the two, hiding a lie between two truths. That's the subtle form of propaganda, and that's the kind of propaganda Lockhart is interested in, and that's the stuff he wants to direct the propagandists towards. And the methods that they use are not too dissimilar to that which was available to Crewe House in the First World War, but there have been some advancements in technology. I mentioned before the dropping of pamphlets, leaflets, newspapers, things like that over the Reich. That starts, that goes back to the First World War,
Yep.
starts again at the Second World War. The leaflets vary in quality. I've got an image there of a leaflet from 1942 showing a comparison. And again, it's a picture speaks 1,000 words stuff. There's England during the Blitz, and that's what Germany is looking like now. And the idea is a simple psychological theme to convey to the German person picking this up, that when you thought the war was over in your favor in 1940, well, guess what? You're in the same state now, and it's only going to get worse. Simple, effective, denting morale, at least in theory, not necessarily always in practice. The other thing that PWE was doing right from the beginning at Woburn, right the way through the war, is developing rumors, or what they called sibs, from the Latin word sibilare, meaning to hiss. So these are fascinating to read. There are files and files full of thousands of these at the National Archives. And these rumors range from laughably bad to middling to, quite frankly, genius. And an example of the latter is one that was disseminated particularly on the Eastern Front. And the way these are disseminated is through a variety of means. Sometimes radio, sometimes agents in occupied territories will just start talking about this stuff at cafes, hoping that Gestapo or whoever's going to listen in, and then it kind of grows from there. And there's a rumor that's put around that there's an outbreak of typhus amongst the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, and the way that they are curing it is by using quinine, which is a malarial treatment. And this is trying to stir up an idea that people will start stockpiling this drug, and in the process, they will actually open up a possible malaria epidemic. So it's trying to control behavior through thoughts and ideas. Another rumor that is not as so successful and actually gets into the British press and gets panned is the rumor they tried to spread about saying that I think it was in 1941 that the British government is importing 200 sharks from Australia to release in the English Channel. And the idea is that when German soldiers hear this rumor, they will be scared about invading Britain, because what happens if they fall off their landing craft? They'll be eaten by a shark. It's absolutely ridiculous. Probably that's come out of a lunch with a lot of beers.
No, that's a bit of a random idea, that one. We've got a quick question for you about the actual use of the word propaganda. So Rob asked the question: did they actually refer to it as propaganda themselves, or did they have a euphemism? Propaganda doesn't sound very British.
Good question. They did use that term, yes. Keep in mind that the political warfare executive is absolutely top secret. Part of the reason that it's based in Woburn is because it's away from prying eyes. So it's all need to know basis stuff. And there is actually the thing about it not being British is an interesting point, because there is an element within Whitehall who do see this as a kind of gentlemen don't read each other's mail thing.
Yeah,
and are looking at this and saying, well, isn't this unseemly? And in fact, Lockhart has to go to bat for some of his propagandists at times when they produce propaganda that is classified as flat out pornographic. There's one of the rumors that spread is that I think it was the Goering's a morphine addict who's having these orgies, and he's getting the wives of submariners round whilst they're risking their lives beneath the waves, and all this kind of stuff. And there's British ministers who point this out and say, well, actually, this isn't cricket, right? And Lockhart basically tells them to sod off and says, have you seen who we're fighting, basically? So yeah, the term propaganda is used, but that's a good point to raise. I have been using the term psychological warfare. It's obviously called the political warfare executive. Just for clarity here, political warfare is the term that is used in Britain, and it is a more polite term for what the Americans, when they joined this race, because the Americans developed their own branch through the Office of Strategic Services, their SOE equivalent. very interested in psychological warfare. There's a connection there, obviously, because OSS in 1947 turns into the CIA. Yep. And when we think of PSYOPs, we tend to think of the CIA. So that term psychological warfare comes from the Americans, but I think it's more widely used in nomenclature now. And to be honest, by the time we get to the end of the war, the British are using it.
It's just interesting that these terms have meaning. Even propaganda, you know, I think of it as a negative connotation these days. And psychological warfare, I'm immediately thinking of things like the Manchurian Candidate, you know, the film back in, you know, that kind of devious, underhand thing that dirty armies do and dirty commies do, and yet the Allies could be very successful at this. And you know, another way of looking at it is kind of hearts and minds. You win over the hearts and minds in a positive way, but you can also use it as a negative way. It's just interesting how we have reactions to these words, and over the course of history, their meaning sort of changes and morphs. I think it's fascinating. We had a quick question by what that building is in the
yes. Well, I was about to get to that, and this ties in nicely because you were mentioning the underhandedness. So that is a top secret building in Milton Bryan in Bedfordshire that housed what were called research units, or RUs, and that's a euphemism for what is essentially a fake news radio station, of which PWE controlled, I think, a little over a dozen at the height of their powers. So what these RUs did was they would get DJs who could speak Italian, French, German, whatever language they're broadcasting in, and they would broadcast into whichever occupied territory or region of the Reich they wanted to. And they would act as if they would present a show as if it was broadcasting from Brussels, Munich, wherever it is. But it's all happening from this building predominantly. This is the main building where these recordings were made. And these shows are, again, they run the gamut from being very basic propaganda, where it's someone in, say, France saying, you know, workers of France rise up against the Nazi menace, to one of the most sophisticated bits of business that PWE does, which Lockhart is fully on board with and backs to the hilt. And that's a RU called Gustav Siegfried I, or GS1, which is run by one of the unsung heroes, to my mind, of the Second World War, a man by the name of Sefton Delmer. And if I click over here, there's a picture of the man. Sefton Delmer is a journalist who had been on the campaign trail with Hitler in the 1930s. He speaks German fluently. He's born in Germany, I think. Or was he born? I think he was born in Australia, raised in Germany. He can speak German thoroughly, fluently, knows the country well, knows its culture, understands how the Reich works. And he and Lockhart hit it off because they both have this understanding of Germany. And what Delmer comes up with is this character that he's going to assume, this persona he's going to assume when broadcasting on Gustav Siegfried I, which is called the chef, or the chief. And this character is basically your archetype of the monocle, like he's Commander Klink. He's the monocled, stiff-backed Prussian conservative. I love my country. We are going to win this war. The Reich will last for 1,000 years. Wonderful. But, and this is the trick, I hate the Nazis. I don't like the Nazis. Hitler's a thug. Goering's a drug addict. You know, Hess was a loony. All this stuff. And they're all debauched and they're all corrupt. And it's actually, it's that program that gets in trouble with Sir Stafford Cripps, in fact, who calls Delmer out for producing pornographic content. And Lockhart has to defend him and say, actually, this is the most widely listened to of our radio stations. From the intelligence they could get from Germany, Germans listened to GS1, and they were, generally speaking, quite receptive to it. It fooled a lot of people. In fact, there's evidence to suggest that Goebbels himself believed that this was an actual dissident German general broadcasting from within Germany, and he set his lads out to find it. So the radio station. So it's very successful, and it plants this seed, this complex psychology behind it, of planting a seed in the minds of German listeners that you may be a patriot, you may believe in this war, you may want us to win, but think about it. Think about, is it worth it? Is it worth us winning on the terms of this little Austrian corporal and all of the, you know, nasty so-and-sos around him? It was very sophisticated stuff. And it's one of the many bits of genius that Delmer comes up with. He's easily Britain's star propagandist working in PWE.
And Stuart Burbage remind us that he was a paternal Al Murray's paternal grandfather worked with Delmer.
Yes.
Another thing I want to touch on, you mentioned Hitler, you know, sending out a unit to find this guy, is with these psyops, political warfare, what you want to call it, is measuring success. I mean, it's difficult enough measuring success of things like, I don't know, the Doolittle raid or the Dambusters raid when there's actually physical results. We're still arguing about what impact that had on the German economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this kind of stuff, you know, setting rumors, you can't kind of poll the German public or the German occupation forces. So how would these units be analyzing the results?
Well, they did have a method, and to your point, it's a rather flawed method. So what they used were what were called comebacks, which are basically feedback gleaned from a variety of sources. These were everything from captured Germans, so they interviewed POWs. They used the listening devices they put in some of the cages that were Germans were detained in to pick up on their chatter. And it's actually from that they get some good intel that one of the more successful campaigns they run towards the end of the war was something called the Malingerer campaign, which involved dropping leaflets around Normandy, which with graphic instructions on it for Wehrmacht soldiers saying, this is how you mutilate your foot or your trigger finger so that you are useless and get sent back away from harm. And a lot of people end up actually, you know, shooting themselves in the foot, cutting through the nerve on the finger, whatever. And captured German surgeons reveal this, that there's an uptick in wounded in that way, self-inflicted wounds.
Wow.
Other comebacks come from spies on the ground in occupied territories, and also from diplomats, particularly in Switzerland, who are in neutral territories, who are listening into all kinds of chatter. So the sources are varied. They're not great. And as you say, coming to a definitive conclusion on the usefulness or lack thereof of PWE is very difficult. In the same way, it's hard to assess SOE. There's an ongoing debate about SOE for the same reason.
Yeah. I suppose you're not talking about a division-sized organization. We're not talking about 15,000 people who could have been doing something else. You know, we're talking about hundreds, I suppose, involved in this. So it's not an expensive thing in some ways compared to how much battleships cost and Lancaster bombers cost. So if it's not providing a major result, it's not like, you know, it's cost. There are other things costing the British government way more, is what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, that's right. It's not expensive, although it does grow more expensive, and it does grow in size. By the time we get to the end of the war, the staff is ballooned above 500. And to your point about whether these people could be deployed elsewhere, I mean, look at Sefton here. Is he going to the front line? You know, I mean, that's the other thing. A lot of these people, they are over the hill types. These are, and again, writers, artists. What are they going to do with a, you know, they're not getting a parachute and jumping out of a plane. This, you know, they're used. When you think about the usefulness, how to deploy people who can string words together, creative types, people who have good broadcast voice, this is a good way to use them. On your point of cost, though, the cost does go up because of this image next to Sefton, which is a very expensive, very state-of-the-art piece of kit called the Aspidistra, which was Churchill loved this thing. This is his fetish for gadgets. This was a high-powered frequency transmitter that Lockhart lobbies to get because he sees its potential. And this is a testament to Lockhart's forward thinking about how psyops can work. He understands that if the only thing better than creating your own radio stations is taking over the enemy's. And so what the Aspidistra can do is it can broadcast at a frequency that can overwhelm German frequencies and at a distance that can penetrate deep into the Reich. What this means in practice is you can, with a flip of the switch of the Aspidistra, you can, while Goebbels is, in the middle of ranting about whatever, you can flip the switch, take over Goebbels's frequency and suddenly you are on the air in Germany. And if you've got a German speaker who can do a good Goebbels impression, you can slide in and start talking about how Hitler, has only got one ball. Hitler is in bed with Goering right now. Whatever you want. And I'm not making those suggestions up. These are genuine suggestions that were coming out of the PWE Brain Trust for how to use this thing. There were other more subtle ones, let's say, about things like, well, this troop division is moving in this direction. The commanders on this front have recalled these people, stuff to confuse and befuddle the enemy. And the Aspidistra is used to that effect in Torch. I think they use it in Husky as well. And certainly in Overlord, it does get used. And it's during Torch, the broadcast is so authentic that they're able to, because of the power of this thing, they're able to broadcast to Rabat in Morocco. And the British naval commander there actually thinks, the American naval commander picks up this transmission, and he thinks that his men have occupied Rabat when they haven't, because he's hearing a transmission that's from there. So the capacity of this thing to deceive about positioning is immense, aside from the myriad psyop opportunities it presents. So it's an investment in kit which is really quite groundbreaking.
It's absolutely amazing stuff, and people are loving it, and people are saying they've heard some of these terms but not really kind of put it together. And I think that's what we were discussing before going live. Some of these names, they come up in so many other books because all roads lead through some of these people, the Ian Flemings of the world, these kind of people that had so many fingers in so many pies. So some of these things I've kind of half read about in various things, and that book takes me back to whatever it's going on to. So it's fantastic to put it all together in one go. So back to you. We've got a few questions for later as well.
Yeah, okay. I'll crack on with what Lockhart does when he gets in charge. So Lockhart, as I said before, he is a more jaded soul than he was back in the day. He's mindful that PWE is not popular with the powers that be. Churchill likes it, but he doesn't think it's a war winner. Okay, he's happy to indulge PWE, but he knows that this war is not going to be won with words alone. And coming from him, that's something to acknowledge that. But so Lockhart tailors PWE towards creating more operational propaganda, which is the kind of propaganda we think about today. And this is where Lockhart, I think, was quite forward thinking. There's no army in the world that goes to war today without some form of operational propaganda. That is to say, propaganda that can support the boots on the ground, that can misdirect, that can reinforce narratives of why these troops are here, what we're fighting for, what we hope to achieve, etc. And one thing that Lockhart is drawn to is the V for Victory campaign. And then if you're saying before about things that people have heard of but don't quite know, this I think is the doozy. So we've all seen the picture, right?
Yeah.
Churchill, we all know that. But where that comes from is actually from a propaganda campaign that starts in January 41, when a member of the Belgian government in exile broadcasts back to his home country and tells his countrymen, take a piece of chalk and start chalking little V's for victory around your town. Do it outside Wehrmacht barracks. Do it outside the police station, the Gestapo, whatever, and all this stuff. And this ends up being something that becomes across much of Western Europe. It becomes a big movement, and you've got people tapping out because the V for 5. You've got people tapping out, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in cafes to unnerve the Wehrmacht soldiers who are dining there and all this sort of stuff. And it rattles Goebbels, and he actually tries to launch a sort of counter V for Victory campaign that fizzles out very quickly. Where Lockhart intervenes is there's more enthusiastic folks on PWE staff who say, you know what, we should actually make this operational. We should raise up this V army, behind the lines to start, setting fire to Gestapo bases and shooting Germans and all this stuff. And Lockhart says, no, we're not doing that. We're not doing that, because if we take this from being a purely psychological operation into actual operation, where we're telling people in the occupied territories, Belgians, French, Poles, etc., we're telling them rise up, then you know what's going to happen? They're going to get massacred, and we're going to get blamed. And this is his savvy. He understands this. He understands that what they're actually going to do is hand a propaganda victory to the Germans. And he's proven right in the aftermath of Operation Anthropoid. The assassination of Reinhard Heydrich by SOE-trained Czech operatives, which ends in a complete disaster with the razing of the village of Lidice and the deportation of those in Lasaki. So he's fully briefed on Anthropoid, which really annoys Stuart Menzies, the head of MI6. He's like, why does Lockhart know about this? It's like, because Lockhart knows about everything. So he understands that. He understands blowback, and I think this is perhaps a lesson he learns from 1918 and what happened to him and his people. That if you go in half-cocked on something, it can have detrimental effects. He instead spends more time thinking about field propagandists, putting people in the field who are going to land as they do with the armies during Operation Torch. They've got megaphones, they've got pamphlets, they are trying to talk to the citizens of the occupied territory, saying, this is why we're here. Don't worry, we're not going to hurt you. We're and all this stuff. And to kind of bring as you said before, hearts and minds aspect to what the actual soldiers are doing. It's less exciting, perhaps, than V for Victory and the idea of engendering some mass uprising, but it is a bit more grounded in reality of what can be achieved. And that's where Lockhart is. He's got a conservative, and he's criticized for being overly conservative, but to my mind, it's quite pragmatic head on his shoulders when it comes to what this stuff can achieve.
It seems to me it's almost like the idea with Ultra of the fact that the Allies used Ultra to a way to improve their odds, but at the same time not let the Germans know that we are getting this information. How can we use this to give us 10% better success in all our operations? And it seems that Lockhart's thinking this is a similar way, is that let this be what it is. Let it help. Let it be there bubbling away, giving an edge to what the Allies are doing. But if you use it too much, you run the danger of causing, as you said earlier, the local populations to rise up and be slaughtered. It must be balanced with caution. It's new, it's radical, but also it could get too out of hand, and that shows a lot of foresight and humanity, I think, on his part.
Definitely. The point about to your Ultra example, there's a suggestion made during, I think it's during the Italian campaign, to use the Aspidistra to broadcast a message saying Mussolini has thrown in the towel, and he's and all and to basically put out before the surrender happens, to say Mussolini has surrendered, it's over, and that gets shot down by Lockhart instantly. He's like, no, because when they find out we've lied, they'll know that we can hijack their frequencies, because this was obviously going to go out on German radio. That was the intent, to hijack German radio. It's like the Germans are going to know something's up, and when the Germans find out that we've done it, they will let everyone know that we've done it, and all of a sudden, our more credible mediums of propaganda, like the BBC, for example, will be brought into question, and the people of Europe will no longer value the British take on things. So yes, he is very perceptive in that regard, and he's particularly perceptive when it comes to the last sort of great operation that PWE conceives of launching towards the end of the war, which is Operation Braddock, which is basically a suggestion of dropping these sabotage packs across Europe, which contain the pistol that I've got in the picture here, and over on the other side of Churchill is an instruction manual from one of these Braddock kits, which comes with its a sort of idiot-proof incendiary device, and that's the instructions there on how to use it. And the plan was to drop as many of these, I think 200,000 they wanted to drop 1 million originally, near Arbeitslager and concentration camps and POW camps, and to basically try to get everyone behind barbed wire in the Reich, get them armed and get them to rise up at the same time that Normandy's happening. Now, Eisenhower loves this. He thinks this is great. But Lockhart, who quite chummy with Eisenhower, as he is with most people, says to him, actually, no, I mean, come on, what's going to happen here? Like, realistically, it might divert some German troops to sort out the bother, but think how much blood is going to be on our hands. And on top of that, there's also the psychological element to this, which was to use it as a force multiplier by dropping propaganda and using rumors and using the RUs to broadcast fake news that would say, actually, that there are these mass uprisings happening behind the line. So it's that thing I mentioned before of hiding a lie between two truths.
Yeah.
Drop a couple of these, drop a few. I think they end up dropping maybe 100,000 Braddocks between July and 1944 and the end of the war. So they don't drop that many. But the idea was, we drop a few, there'll be some fires lit, there'll be some trouble started. But if we drop propaganda that says, actually, Armageddon is descending on the Reich from behind the lines, then that will start a panic, which it doesn't really. But in some theaters, you do get some commanders who overreact, who divert forces that could have been used better elsewhere. And that's really the story of PWE during the D-Day landings. They were able to send out some messages about troop movements that add to confusion when the Germans are trying to put people into position. But they don't have some grand. There's no Operation Mincemeat for them. There's no grand, success story that they can sort of hang their hat.
I mean, the discussion is going on a sidebar about the Liberator pistol. I remember when I first saw a picture of one of them in a book when I was about 12 years old or something, and I don't know that I've ever read a case of one actually ever being used in anger.
It's a Derringer, isn't it? I mean, it's
it's going to be a point blank range. You got one shot, But the thing is, if I was in one of the remote parts of France, in the Vercors or in the forest or something, and you're not. You as a resistance worker, you're not on the radio. It's the radio operator who's getting messages, and so you're at a distance from thing, and you're going to be feeling. Does anyone give a shit about us? Are we being supported? Are we getting any idea? But if you kind of feel that there are these things being dropped to people near you, I think that feeling alone of, hang on, we're not in this alone. We are part of a resource. There's a resource there that is dropping stuff out, even if they're not being used. My enthusiasm for doing what it is I'm doing, which is, I don't know, monitoring German troop movements or putting demolitions on a train, I'm going to feel more part of a team and then because of this thing than actually the use of it itself, the application of it, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no, precisely. And that's the psychological element of this. There were some key themes that PWE explored, and one of them was exactly what you're describing there, the idea of galvanizing resistance, making resistance feel like they are part of a bigger thing. And that's what the V for Victory campaign was. It was the idea of bringing everyone together. But the question of how to make that operational in a safe and effective way, Lockhart had a dictum that did not go down well with some of his more excitable propagandists, but his idea was that until the war starts turning our way, until we've actually got military assets in the place they need to be, propaganda is next to useless. We need the welly to back this up. And so when D-Day is happening, and that's why it's really after Torch that PWE starts ramping up its operations, because there's actual offensives for them to back. And that's why when it comes to D-Day, by the time they get to that point, he's looking at this situation and going, well, I'm not sure a couple of fires and some Liberator pistols are going to make much of a difference at this point. But the sentiment behind them might, and the broadcasting of messages of support. On D-Day, Lockhart has the unenviable task of chaperoning de Gaulle to the microphone so that he can give his speech on this is a great day for France, etc., etc. He's in charge of that, and having to kind of talk him through that. And to Lockhart's mind, that stuff in that moment, when Allied boots are landing on French soil, he sees the value of that. You get de Gaulle there at the precise moment that's happening, broadcasting to the French people, saying, "You've been waiting for it. Here it is. We're all in this together now. The liberation of the country's coming." That's the stuff that he places a lot more value on than these kind of wild gambits, which says a lot about his perhaps maturing process from his time of being British agent through to the end of the
definitely.
Second World War.
A wisdom, an accrued wisdom over the years. Yeah,
that's it. So just to wrap this up, Lockhart was a very old and tired man and quite ill. By the end of the Second World War, he was suffering all kinds of illness, mainly brought on by a life of indulgence, too many long nights, very, very stressed as well. The flat that he occupied in London was hit by a bomb a day before he returned from Scotland. So he was actually caught in bombing on a couple of occasions during his time in London. A dinner party he was at was hit by a bomb, and he had to fly to the ground. So he's in some dangerous situations during the war. He's old, he's tired, he's stressed, he's ill, and there's some interesting passages in some of his writings towards the end of the war where he warns of a future where the distortion of news that PWE has partaken in, and the Ministry of Information, he worries about states using this into peacetime, which obviously, given where we are now in the world, is quite prescient. He sees that this is that Pandora's box has been opened here, and he doesn't want to really be a part of it. But to my point before, I said about how this guy there is always an adventurous little boy in Lockhart. To the day he dies in 1970, it's always there. And so he wants to extract himself. He wants to go live in a cottage in the countryside and write his books. That's what he wants to do after the war. But instead, he keeps getting pulled back. Eden brings him back and says, "Look, no one knows more about Russia than you. We've got this problem now with Stalin. What do you know about Stalin? Tell us about Stalin. Tell us about how these guys operate." And he also works with Radio Free Europe, which is a CIA front to do propaganda in Europe. And he broadcasts into Czechoslovakia for, I think, about 14 years. He broadcasts a weekly anti-Soviet, well, it becomes very anti-Soviet after the revolution there in 1948, program to kind of, he's a cold warrior behind a microphone, basically. Until he gets to the point in the early 60s where he's just too tired to do even that, and he shuffles off into a quite well-earned retirement. But as I say, he does so when he leaves PWE at the end of the war. He does so with that warning of where this could go if we let this grow unfettered.
There's so many moments of this kind of foreshadowing where we are today, when news goes from being news to entertainment, and even today news channels have to list themselves under entertainment rather than news, and it's all sort of connected to this. But to start to round things up, when we talk about some of these figures involved in these intriguing things, the Popoffs and the Flemings things, is that so many of them get into the post-war memoirs where they can be guilty of embellishment and I won the war. Man, he doesn't get involved because of his age and stuff. He doesn't get in that kind of I'm the great one who won the war memoir coming out in the 50s.
No, he writes a memoir called Comes the Reckoning. He wrote I think 13 books over the course of his life, and they're all memoirs or accounts of the famous people he's met. And Comes the Reckoning is a book that is basically it's quite unique in the post-war literature, because it's him basically saying, well, PWE was kind of the shits, and propaganda was not nearly as effective as people like to think, and Whitehall was hideously inefficient. And he actually leaves a lot of good asides in there about just the nature of Whitehall and how it operated, and some of the less I guess, gallant aspects of Britain's war story. And he himself is brutally honest with his readers throughout his life about his own vices, his own failings, his own faults, as a servant of the crown, as a writer, as an author, as a husband, as a friend. He is very candid about his own failings. He does, I think, perhaps embellish his role at PWE a little bit, and does make it out like he's a kind of a knight in shining armor riding to its rescue, which there's some element of truth to that in terms of the politics and how he manages to legitimize PWE to an extent, and get it some of the respect I don't think it would have otherwise gotten from the other service chiefs. But in the main, yeah, his post-war memoirs are really they increasingly become I wouldn't say embittered, but honest, very honest.
Maybe he was. I'm not drawing parallels to Oppenheimer directly, but in that he's been part of something, this new type of warfare that he's at the same one. On the one hand, he's saying it achieved these really good things. The other hand, he's kind of playing it down, saying no, it was useless, really, as if he himself is a little bit confused about it and maybe a bit guilty about being part of this new type of warfare. And I'm not comparing it to the development of nuclear weapons, but there is a sort of a parallel. And the fact that he has been part of it. So at times he's kind of proud of the monster he created, and other times he's not. That seems to be a fairly logical place for him to be, in that kind of, it had a good side, it had a bad side, because that is the nature of propaganda. We can all think of good, positive things coming together, and sound bites and slogans and catchphrases. They can be brilliant and they can also be damaging, and he's sort of part of that world, I guess.
Yeah, you said confused. Confused is a good word. That's basically what he is. He's not sure what this beast is that he's helped to awaken, but he knows that it's got a role, but he can see the dangers of it. And I think he also is of a mind, and this goes back to his time in Russia, where not the main element, but an element of why his plot against Lenin fails is because British policy is a little bit out of whack with the intelligence operations that are happening on the ground. There's not much alignment there, and in the early years of the post Second World War, Cold War, he is frustrated by the fact that Britain itself doesn't seem to want to know what to do with the Soviets. Are we going to try to remain friends with Stalin, or are we going to call this quits now? What are we actually doing? And he's saying to himself this whole time, if you don't know what you want to achieve, how can you propagandize? If you don't know what the message is, how can you disseminate it? So confusion is the word there. He is confused. The British government is confused. And that's part of the reason why he increasingly, as the 50s drags on, he starts checking more and more out of official life.
Yeah, well, it's sort of a slightly depressing note to end on, but at the same time, an incredible information about this extraordinary person who had more involvement in the war than perhaps most of us watching kind of realized. The fact he's at de Gaulle's side doing the radio broadcasts, he's having discussions with Eisenhower about Torch and Overlord later on. And one of those figures that kind of runs through these events without us necessarily ever kind of noticing him there. And I think my takeaway will be that the measuring of this, we're struggling on this channel to measure the successes as you talked about, of SOE and some of the early commando raids where everybody dies. But did they sow this thought in the Germans that the Allies can strike anywhere? And yes, they did. But was it worth sending in people to die on an aqueduct in Italy just to sow that doubt? But that's where we are. We're 80 years on. We're at the point where we're able to kind of examine some of these things and say, well, what did it do? And the reality, I think, is that there are very few of these things are the game changers that we think they are. The books that this is the thing that won the war. This is the tank that broke it. It doesn't work like that. The war is the victory achieved by thousands of things that stack up on one side of the scales against the thousands of things the enemy have on their side of the scales. And this is one of the tools, one of those weights on the scales the Allies are implementing. Did it win World War II on its own? No, neither did the Hobart's Funnies, neither did the SOE, neither did Ultra. But add them all together, and I think it's an example of that inventiveness that was going on in sort of 1920s and the 30s, and that's, I think, where we're going to come back to.
Yeah, that's a far more hopeful tone to end on.
Yeah, that's better. So, folks, there you are. There's my copy of the book, the advanced one there. You know where to go and get what to do. The links in the description below. I think it's to buy in UK and pre-order in the US. Is that right? Does that sound right?
It's coming out in the US on another publisher in March, I believe.
Right.
But of course, you can, we live in an interconnected world. You can order these things on Amazon and get it over there. It'll be stocked in whatever shops. But yeah, it'll be out. It'll be out in the UK next week.
Brilliant stuff. So it's been fantastic talking to you, James. And as always, it's a show that gives me more to think about overnight, which is always good. Folks, 2 shows tomorrow. Kevin Hemel's coming on talking about Patton's Brittany dilemma. And then we're talking about some archaeological work in Provence in the Dragoon campaign. So that's all as coming up tomorrow. And then Roger Cirillo on Friday is talking about the Allied campaign from Normandy right up to Arnhem. And then we carry on with Arnhem next week. So thank you, James. Thank you, viewers, for your questions. I will see you all again twice tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers, Paul.